I thought buying my dream home in a quiet neighborhood would finally bring peace, but the letters started coming before I'd even unpacked. Fines, threats, violation notices for things that didn't exist. Then came the meeting. Every neighbor turned against me, reading rules I never agreed to, shouting about a homeowners association I wasn't even part of. That's when I realized this wasn't just about property lines, it was about control. And the harder I resisted, the darker their tactics became. So tell me, what would you do when the HOA decides you don't belong? When Emma Carter finally bought her house on Willow Creek Lane, it felt like the kind of victory you only dream about. After years of renting tiny apartments and saving every spare dollar, she'd found a place that felt alive. Quiet streets framed by oak trees, a wraparound porch with chipped white paint, and enough yard for her golden retriever Daisy to run free. The house itself wasn't perfect. The shutters leaned, the fence needed mending, but it had character. And in a neighborhood of identical polished homes, that character made it stand out. Most of the neighbors were friendly enough at first. There was Janet from across the street, always trimming her rose bushes, and the older couple next door who waved every morning as Emma left for work. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, and every weekend you'd hear the soft hum of lawn mowers and the laughter of kids on bikes. It was the kind of place that made you feel like you'd finally arrived. But from the start, there were hints, little things that didn't quite fit. On her second day there, a folded paper appeared on her porch. No envelope, no greeting. Just a printed list titled Community Guidelines for Harmony and Consistency. Emma smiled at first, assuming it was just some friendly welcome packet. But as she read, her brow furrowed. It wasn't from a city office or a local board. It was from something called the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. Only one problem. Her property wasn't technically within the HOA's boundary lines. She brushed it off. Maybe it was a simple mistake. But over the next few weeks, the tone of the neighborhood shifted. Conversations felt more cautious. Neighbors who once waved started glancing at her mailbox instead. She overheard bits of chatter, non-compliant fencing, unsanctioned paint colors, and then there were the letters. The first one was polite. We've noticed certain exterior modifications that do not align with community standards. The next was colder, a formal notice of violation with a warning about escalating fines. Emma double-checked. The county records to be sure her house had never been part of any HOA jurisdiction. She'd made certain of it before buying, but apparently the HOA saw it differently. Still, she wanted to keep the peace. She replaced the old mailbox, even though she preferred the rustic one that came with the house. She kept the lawn a little shorter. She thought that would be enough, but compliance didn't bring relief. It brought attention. Janet, the rosebush neighbor, started stopping by uninvited, casually mentioning that the board wanted to see her landscaping plans. One morning, Emma came home from work to find a measuring tape stretched across her driveway, a clipboard lying in the grass. Something wasn't right. The neighborhood that once felt peaceful now felt watchful, too quiet, too perfect. Like a place where every curtain hid an opinion and every rule had a target. Emma told herself she was imagining things. After all, how much harm could a group of suburban volunteers really cause? But late one Friday evening, she saw a car idling outside her home, its headlights off, its engine humming softly in the dark. And the next morning, another envelope appeared on her porch. This one wasn't printed. It was handwritten, and in bold, shaky letters across the front, it read, "You can't ignore the HOA forever." The morning after the handwritten note appeared, Emma stood on her porch for nearly a full minute, staring at it. The paper was damp from the night air, edges curled like it had been left in haste. She unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, not printed, not official, but the message beneath was clear. You can't ignore the HOA forever. Her stomach sank. It wasn't just about a letter now. Someone had been here, on her porch, while she slept. That evening, she went online, searching for any mention of Willow Creek HOA or extended boundary. What she found made her pulse quicken. 6 months earlier, the association had voted, privately, to expand community oversight into adjacent properties of shared visual interest. In plain English, they'd decided her property, though legally outside their jurisdiction, looked too close to the community to be exempt from their rules. No city approval, no consent. Just a vote in a meeting she hadn't even known existed. The next week, things escalated. A bright orange notice of assessment was taped to her front door, listing a $250 fine for failure to submit exterior color modification for review. Emma laughed out loud at first. She hadn't painted a thing. The house looked the same as when she bought it. But when she peeled the notice off, she saw a photo attached, her porch, taken from across the street. That meant someone was watching. She brought the notice inside, laid it on the kitchen counter, and tried to shake off the creeping unease. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. understanding. Maybe if she just called, they'd sort it out. So she did. The number led to a voicemail. Thank you for contacting Willow Creek HOA. Office hours are Monday through Thursday, 9 to 3. Leave your name, address, and case number. She left a message. No one called back. 2 days later, another notice arrived. This one for unauthorized trash container placement. Fine, $50. Then one for non-standard fencing height. Fine, $125. By the end of the month, the total had reached $925. Emma knew she didn't owe them a cent. But she also knew that in neighborhoods like this, paperwork had power. Once fines were filed, they had a way of sticking, showing up on records, complicating insurance, even threatening resale value. She needed help. At the county office, a clerk confirmed what she already suspected. Her property wasn't listed within the HOA's governing plat. But when Emma showed the stack of notices, the clerk frowned. These are persistent, she said carefully. We've had a few complaints about Willow Creek overreach, but most people just give in and pay to make it stop. Emma's jaw tightened. So they can just harass people until they do? The woman sighed. Technically? No, practically. They've got lawyers. That was the day Emma decided to stop being polite. She started documenting everything. Every envelope, every timestamp, every neighbor's glance. She installed cameras on her porch and driveway, though that, too, drew complaints. One afternoon, she caught Janet, the rosebush neighbor, standing in her yard with a clipboard, snapping photos of Daisy's doghouse. When Emma stepped outside, Janet jumped. Oh, just checking property alignment, she stammered, pretending to measure the fence. With what authority? Emma asked. Janet's voice dropped to a whisper. Greg said we had to keep the visuals consistent. Greg who? Greg Thorne, HOA president. That name would soon become her waking nightmare. Greg Thorne was the kind of man who smiled with his teeth, but not his eyes. Late 40s, pressed shirts, the kind of suburban confidence that came from holding a gavel in meetings about mailbox heights. When Emma called him, his tone was calm, almost rehearsed. Ms. Carter, he said, we're simply maintaining the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity. Your property affects our community's value. My house isn't part of your community, she snapped. A pause. Then, maybe not legally, but visually, yes. And we have a responsibility to protect our standards. He hung up before she could reply. Days later, she woke to find the word violation spray painted across her driveway in red. She called the police. They took a report but said without video evidence, there wasn't much they could do. That same afternoon, she received a letter from the HOA accusing her of defacing community property. She couldn't believe it. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching the streetlights flicker against the stillness of manicured lawns. A car rolled by slowly, a silver SUV. She recognized it, Greg's. Over the next few weeks, the harassment turned methodical. Her mail started arriving open. Packages disappeared from her porch. Neighbors who used to smile now looked away. When she walked Daisy, conversations stopped mid-sentence. And then one morning, she found something chilling in her mailbox. Not a notice, but a petition. It stated that the majority of residents had voted to annex her property formally into the HOA. There was a list of signatures, dozens of them. At the bottom, a final line read, effective immediately. All Willow Creek HOA policies shall apply to 312 Willow Creek Lane, her address. She stormed into the next HOA meeting, held in the clubhouse across the street. It was the first time most of them had seen her up close. The outsider everyone whispered about. The room fell quiet when she entered. I'm not part of your HOA, she said firmly. You have no right to fine me, threaten me, or enter my property. Greg smiled from the head of the table. We're simply formalizing what's already true. Ms. Carter, your home affects our neighborhood's visual landscape. My home isn't your property. A murmur spread through the room. Whispers, a cough, a few uncomfortable glances. Greg leaned forward. If you want to avoid further conflict, you can simply sign the membership acknowledgement. It's a standard process. Then we can discuss reversing your fines. Emma stared at him. You're extorting me. He didn't deny it. When she refused, the fines doubled. Then came letters from a law firm representing Willow Creek, HOA in ongoing compliance disputes. They claimed her property's nonconformity was lowering neighborhood values. The stress became suffocating. She started recording every call, every interaction. She stopped gardening, stopped inviting friends over. The house she once loved now felt like a trap. And then came the final straw. One evening, as a storm rolled in, Emma noticed a flicker of light outside, near her fence line. She went to check and found two men in rain jackets digging near her property marker. She shouted, but they ran. The next morning, the boundary stake was gone, replaced by a new one, 5 feet closer to her house. They were literally moving the property line. Emma called the county again, filed another complaint, and hired a surveyor. The results confirmed what she suspected. The HOA had submitted a falsified boundary map, but as she prepared to take it to court, a new notice arrived, this time not taped to her door but nailed to her fence. Immediate compliance required. Failure to align will result in legal action. Attached was a copy of her own deed, altered. Her property now listed under shared management with the Willow Creek Association. It was fraud. Plain and simple, but proving it would take time and money she didn't have. As weeks dragged on, Emma began noticing unmarked cars parked near her street at night. Her motion cameras caught glimpses of figures walking by, flashlights scanning her yard. When she called the sheriff's department again, the deputy sighed. "Ms. Carter, HOAs operate in a gray area. Unless there's direct property damage or trespassing we can prove, there's not much we can do." She felt the walls closing in. Greg's words echoed in her head. "We're protecting our standards." One night, exhausted and desperate, Emma sat on her porch with Daisy at her feet, the camera lights blinking faintly behind her. The air was thick with humidity and the low hum of cicadas. Across the street, Janet's blinds shifted. A figure stood there, watching. Then her phone buzzed. A new message. "Unknown number. It's easier if you just join, Emma. Everyone else already has." She froze. That was the moment the fear turned into resolve. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to bow. If they wanted a fight, they'd picked the wrong homeowner. The county audit came back faster than Emma expected. 3 days after filing, she got the call. A quiet-voiced clerk asking if she could come down in person. That tone alone told her something wasn't right. When she arrived, the clerk handed her a thin folder. Inside was her property file, maps, deeds, and a list of recent boundary adjustments. Her signature appeared 3 times, except it wasn't hers. The HOA had forged her name. Her throat went dry as she stared at the shaky imitation of her handwriting, a name she'd written thousands of times now twisted into a weapon against her. "This," the clerk said, lowering her voice, "isn't just overreach. It's criminal falsification of a public record." Emma's hands trembled as she clutched the folder. "Can I get a certified copy?" The clerk nodded, slid the file into a manila envelope, and whispered, "Be careful, Miss Carter. People around here don't like being challenged." That night, thunder rolled over Willow Creek as if the sky itself had been waiting for a storm. Emma sat at her dining table, surrounded by stacks of papers, photos, and letters. Daisy lay quietly at her feet, sensing the tension in the room. For months, the HOA had bullied her with impunity. Fake votes, illegal fines, vandalism, intimidation. But now she had proof. Still, proof meant nothing unless it was seen, so she made a decision. She would show up, not with anger this time, but with evidence. The next HOA meeting was set for Thursday evening at the clubhouse. The agenda, as always, was printed in smug Helvetica. Review of community compliance issues. Ms. Carter's case. They thought they were about to humiliate her. They had no idea what was coming. By the time she arrived, the parking lot was full. Word had spread about the rebellious homeowner, the one fighting the board. Residents filled the small hall, their folding chairs lined in perfect rows beneath humming fluorescent lights. Greg Thorne sat at the front, flanked by board members in crisp polos, their expressions composed but wary. As Emma walked in, the low murmur of conversation fell into silence. Greg cleared his throat. "Miss Carter, thank you for attending. As you're aware, this meeting concerns your continued non-compliance with HOA standards and your refusal to pay assessed fines. Before we proceed, would you like to address the board?" Emma set her folder down on the table. "Yes," she said, "I would." Her voice didn't shake. She began by reading the list of fines, every absurd charge from mailbox paint to imaginary fence violations. Murmurs rippled through the audience. Then she lifted one of the envelopes and held it up. "This is harassment," she said, "and it's gone too far." Greg smiled tightly. "Miss Carter, we've followed due process." "You're simply misunderstanding." She cut him off. "Due process doesn't include forging legal documents." A hush fell over the room. Greg froze. Emma pulled out the certified copies and placed them on the table. "Here's the county file, including the signatures you forged to claim partial management of my property. And here," she said, sliding out a photo, "is a time-stamped image of 2 of your board members trespassing on my land to move boundary stakes." Gasps filled the room. A few residents shifted uncomfortably. Greg's composure cracked. "That's ridiculous. Anyone could—" Emma pressed play on her phone. The audio recording was grainy but clear, his voice unmistakable from their last call. "Maybe not legally, but visually, yes. And we have a responsibility to protect our standards." The sound echoed in the silent room. room. Emma looked straight at him. "You knew exactly what you were doing." For the first time, Greg's confident smirk faltered. He whispered something to a board member who immediately stood up, but residents were already whispering, turning toward one another in disbelief. Emma took a deep breath and continued. "The HOA has no jurisdiction over my property, and yet you falsified documents, trespassed, vandalized, and tried to extort me into joining your association. I filed a formal complaint with the county recorder's office and a police report for forgery and property fraud." Greg slammed his palm against the table. "That's enough!" But his voice cracked. Emma didn't back down. "No, Greg. You've taken enough." A woman in the audience, someone who'd signed the annexation petition, slowly raised her hand. "Is that true?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Did you forge her documents?" Greg didn't answer. The silence was louder than any confession. Within minutes, the meeting dissolved into chaos. Residents demanded explanations. Board members whispered frantically. Greg tried to restore order, but the authority he'd built for years was crumbling right in front of him. Then, as if fate wanted to twist the knife, a voice from the back called out, "She's not the only one." All heads turned. An older man stood, clutching a stack of papers. "You pulled the same thing with my property last year. Said I owed landscaping fees when I'm not even in your zone?" Another voice joined in. "Same here. I've been paying fines for months because I didn't want trouble." Within moments, the room erupted, a storm of outrage, disbelief, and betrayal. Greg tried shouting over them, but the noise drowned him out. Emma stood there, heart pounding, the weight of months of fear finally beginning to lift. This was it, the turning point. When the police arrived an hour later, summoned by one of the panicked board members, Greg's calm veneer had shattered completely. Officers gathered statements while residents stood outside in clusters, murmuring in shock. Emma watched as Greg spoke hurriedly to one of the officers, gesturing wildly toward her. But the officer only nodded, expressionless, then walked away toward the evidence folder she'd provided. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Greg Thorne, the man who'd made her life hell for nearly half a year, was being led out of the clubhouse in handcuffs. The crowd parted silently as he passed. Emma didn't say a word. She didn't need to, but victory didn't come with instant relief. When she returned home that night, exhaustion hit her like a wave. The porch light flickered softly against the stillness of her yard. Daisy wagged her tail, waiting at the door, and for the first time in months, Emma smiled. She knelt, wrapping her arms around the dog. "We did it, girl," she whispered. "We're free." Yet even as she said it, a thought lingered. How many others had gone through the same thing and never fought back? She opened her laptop and began typing. A detailed summary of everything that had happened, from the first letter to the last confrontation. She posted it publicly, along with copies of the documents, recordings, and timestamps. By morning, it had spread across local forums and social media pages. The headline read, "Homeowner exposes HOA forgery and corruption in Willow Creek." And just like that, the story Emma had lived in silence for months became everyone's conversation. The next day, she drove past the clubhouse. The HOA's sign had been taken down, its office locked. A notice from the county hung on the door. "Under investigation, pending review." Some neighbors waved as she passed, cautiously this time, but with something new in their faces. Respect, gratitude, maybe even guilt. Emma didn't wave back. She simply smiled faintly and kept driving, the morning sun breaking through the clouds as she turned onto the main road. The neighborhood behind her looked smaller somehow, but she didn't feel small anymore. That evening, as the sky burned gold over Willow Creek, she stood on her porch with a cup of tea. The air was quiet. No cameras, no cars idling in the dark, no clipped whispers behind curtains. Just the sound of wind in the oaks and Daisy's collar jingling softly. She thought about everything she'd lost. Sleep, peace, trust, and everything she'd gained. Proof, strength, her voice. Sometimes, she realized, standing your ground isn't about winning a war. It's about reminding people that one voice can still be louder than a crowd that's wrong. As the last light faded, she whispered to herself, "They tried to take my home, but I took back my power." For the first time in months, the silence around Willow Creek felt like peace, not tension. No more midnight cars idling outside her home. No more envelopes taped to her door. Just quiet. Real, earned quiet. The week after Greg Thorne's arrest, the county launched a full investigation into the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. What they uncovered spread far beyond Emma's single case. Over a dozen homeowners came forward with stories that echoed hers. Fines they never agreed to, signatures they never wrote, threats they'd been too afraid to challenge. Some had lost thousands of dollars. A few had even sold their homes to escape the stress. For years, Greg and his board had used fear as a weapon, weaponized silence, social pressure, and paperwork. And it had worked until Emma. Her courage cracked something open. The county attorney's office reached out again a few days later. The invitation she'd received wasn't a summons, it was an offer. They wanted her to testify. At first, she hesitated. The idea of reliving it all, the threats, the humiliation, The paranoia made her stomach twist. But when she looked around her home at the porch she'd rebuilt with her own hands, at Daisy asleep in her favorite corner, she realized this was her chance to make it mean something, so she agreed. The hearing took place in a windowless municipal chamber, the kind where the air feels recycled and fluorescent lights buzz faintly above. Reporters filled the benches, neighbors lined the walls, some curious, others ashamed. Greg Thorne sat at the defense table, pale, jaw clenched. Gone was the smug confidence, the ironed shirts, the polished voice of authority. In its place was something brittle, a man realizing the control he'd built on fear was finally collapsing. When it was Emma's turn to speak, she didn't read from notes. She spoke plainly. She told them how it started. The letters, the harassment, the false petitions, how the fear had crept into her every day until her home felt less like a refuge and more like a cage. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just told the truth. And when she finished, the room was silent. Even Greg couldn't meet her eyes. The investigation concluded with 12 formal charges, including document forgery, fraud, and harassment. The HOA board was dissolved. The community's funds, mismanaged for years, were seized and audited. Greg was removed as president and later convicted of falsifying public records. But the real victory wasn't in the headlines or the verdicts. It was what came after. The residents of Willow Creek, for the first time in a decade, began to talk to each other. Really talk. Without the shadow of the HOA dictating every blade of grass or shade of paint, they started sharing stories, trading tools, planting gardens together. The fences that had once divided them, both literally and emotionally, began to blur. And Emma, she became the quiet center of that change. At first, she didn't want the attention. Reporters called, local news outlets asked for interviews, even a podcast wanted her to retell her story. She declined most of them. But one evening, she agreed to a community town hall at the local library, not to relive the drama, but to share what she'd learned. The room was full, but not tense. People came from other neighborhoods, too. Homeowners dealing with similar HOA nightmares, families afraid to speak up. She stood at the front, hands clasped loosely, and said something that would later go viral. They built their power on the hope that we'd stay quiet. The moment you speak, the moment you refuse to sign what isn't right, that power disappears. Applause filled the room. It wasn't loud or frenzied, just steady, heartfelt, the kind that said, "We understand now." Months passed. The county implemented new regulations for HOAs, requiring transparency, third-party audits, and homeowner consent for any rule changes or boundary expansions. The Willow Creek case, as it came to be known, became a teaching example for communities across the state. Emma received letters from strangers, people she'd never met, thanking her for giving them courage to push back against their own boards, to question fines, to demand accountability. One email stood out. It was from a single mother 2 towns over. She wrote, "I almost sold my home because my HOA told me I wasn't allowed to hang laundry outside. They threatened me week after week. I saw your story online. Yesterday, I told them to show me the law, and they couldn't. You saved my home." Emma read it twice, tears blurring her vision. She'd never meant to start anything bigger than her own defense. But somehow, standing up for herself had become something larger, a quiet rebellion that spread farther than she ever imagined. Life slowly returned to normal, but it wasn't the same kind of normal as before. It was better. Her mornings were peaceful again. Coffee on the porch, Daisy chasing squirrels, the hum of lawnmowers that no longer made her tense. The mailbox was no longer a source of dread. The only letters now were real ones. Thank yous, newsletters, the occasional invitation to speak at homeowner reform panels. She never called herself an activist. She didn't want to be a symbol. She just wanted to live in peace, but she knew deep down that peace wasn't something handed to you. It was something you defended. One late afternoon, she was repainting the porch railings when Janet, the rosebush neighbor, walked up the path, carrying a tray of lemonade. Emma paused, unsure how to react. "I owed you this," Janet said softly. "An apology. I was wrong to stay quiet." "We all were." Emma hesitated, then smiled. "You don't owe me anything. Just promise you'll never let anyone control your voice again." Janet nodded, setting down the tray. "That's a promise." They sat together for a while, sipping lemonade, watching the sun dip behind the trees. For the first time, there was no pretense. No walls, just 2 neighbors finally seeing each other as people, not as property lines. A few months later, Emma received one last letter, this time with an official seal from the county attorney's office. It wasn't another request for testimony. It was a certificate of appreciation for her courage and contribution to homeowner rights advocacy. She framed it, not out of pride, but as a reminder. Even in small neighborhoods, small voices matter. That winter, the Willow Creek HOA sign, once a symbol of control, was taken down permanently. In its place, residents voted to plant a tree, a white oak, strong, slow-growing, and deeply rooted. They called it the Carter Oak. Every spring, the community gathered beneath its branches for a neighborhood picnic. No rules, no fines, no agenda, just people finally living as neighbors again, And though Emma never sought attention, she always brought Daisy a few homemade pies and that quiet smile that said more than words ever could. In the years that followed, the story of Willow Creek traveled far beyond their little town. It appeared in articles, homeowner forums, even university law studies about overreach and power abuse. Some people saw it as a cautionary tale. Others saw it as proof that even one determined homeowner could expose a system built on intimidation. But for Emma, it was something simpler, a personal promise fulfilled. She had fought for her home, and in doing so, she'd found something more important than property: freedom. One evening, long after the headlines faded and the white oak's branches had grown wide and strong, Emma stood on her porch again, watching the golden light filter through the leaves. Her phone buzzed with another email, a journalist asking for an update, wondering if she still believed in peaceful communities. She smiled and typed back just one sentence: "I still believe in good neighbors. I just don't believe in fear anymore." She set the phone down, breathed in the cool evening air, and whispered, not to the HOA, not to the town, but to herself, "They tried to take my home, but in the end, they gave me something better: my voice."